We were at the Hendersons' house that night, just me, Amy, and a few of our closest friends. It was one of those easygoing nights, beer, chips, some old rock playlist humming in the background while we all kicked back on their worn-out leather couch. Conversations drifted from work gripes to family gossip, and eventually, we got onto relationships, as you do. Someone mentioned celebrity crushes, and Amy perked up, jumping right in with Joshua Langston, like it was common knowledge. Now, I'll admit it made me pause. Joshua Langston was a soap star she'd watched for years. But still, it felt harmless, so I laughed it off. Then suddenly, the conversation took this weird turn. The others started joking about hall passes, that hypothetical, no-strings chance to be with someone famous. It was all supposed to be in fun, you know? Just jokes. But Amy was laughing along a bit too eagerly, nodding and saying, "Oh, if Joshua Langston ever looked my way, I'd take it." She threw me this grin, and everyone laughed, a bit louder than I expected. There was a beat, this silent moment where I was watching her, trying to see if she'd laugh it off too. But she didn't. She was still smiling, shrugging her shoulders like, why not? Everyone took it as a joke, maybe she did too. I didn't know for sure. So I went along with it, tried to play it cool, even though something about it bugged me. Can't say I'm into the whole hall pass idea, I'd muttered, maybe a little too quietly. I'd seen too many friends wreck their marriages with justifications and exceptions. I believed marriage meant staying loyal, period. Amy gave me a teasing eye roll, patted my hand, and the conversation moved on. By the end of the night, I figured we'd all just had a few too many drinks and that was that. And honestly, by the next day, I barely thought about it. Just a dumb, throwaway moment with friends, right? Well, that was years ago. Life went on, like it does, and any mention of hall passes faded into some hazy, forgettable joke we barely thought about. Amy and I fell into our usual routines, her job, my work, raising the kids. There was the occasional rough patch like any marriage, but nothing major. I'd always thought of us as a pretty solid team. Then, about a month ago, she had to attend a conference in the city. It wasn't unusual, she'd had business trips before. Usually, she'd call me around dinner time to say goodnight to the kids, maybe text a bit about how the sessions were going. But this time, she was quieter, a little more distant. The third night in, around 9:30, my phone rings. It's Amy. I'm expecting the usual check-in, maybe some tired complaints about her work schedule. But right away, I can tell something's different. She sounds off. Casual, but in a way that felt too casual, like she was forcing it. "Hey," she says, dragging out the word. "How's it going?" I frown at the phone. Fine. We're just winding down here. How's the conference?" "Good. Great, actually." There's a pause, a weird little silence that puts me on edge. "I actually ran into someone," she says, her voice strange, almost like she's holding back a laugh. "Joshua Langston." I went still, the name hitting like a stone in my stomach. She kept talking, going on about how she'd seen him across the hotel lobby, how she'd been starstruck, how he was every bit as charming as she'd imagined. I forced a chuckle. "Wow, that's something." And then, like it was no big deal, she says, "So, I'm using my hall pass tonight." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. "What?" "My hall pass, Mark," she says, her tone just a bit patronizing. "We talked about this, remember? That night at the Hendersons." My chest goes tight. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, like the air had just been sucked out of the room. For a second, I thought she was still joking, that she was pulling my leg, trying to get a reaction. But she was dead serious. "Wait, Amy, are you saying you're actually going through with this?" She lets out this airy laugh. "Mark, come on. It's Joshua Langston. We agreed, didn't we?" I felt like I was spinning. My mind raced back to that night years ago, the laughter, the casual joking. We didn't agree on anything. "I thought it was just a stupid joke, Amy. You can't just—" "Oh, don't be dramatic," she cuts in, sounding almost annoyed. "You knew I was serious." I was at a loss for words. I tried to reason with her, to get her to understand how messed up this was, how blindsided I felt. But she just kept brushing me off, acting like this was no big deal. Finally, she told me she had to go, that he was waiting, and she hung up, just like that. I stood there, phone still in my hand, staring at the screen in shock. A numbness settled over me. I couldn't believe she'd actually gone through with it, like everything we'd built over the years was just a suggestion she could walk away from on a whim. That night I barely slept. I kept staring at my phone, half expecting Amy to call and say it was a joke, that she hadn't actually gone through with it. But the hours passed, and there was nothing. The next morning, I tried calling her. No answer. Sent a text, just a simple, "Can we talk?" Still nothing. My mind raced. Did she really do it? Was she just avoiding me out of guilt? Or maybe she'd finally realized what a huge mistake this was. Either way, I needed answers. By noon, the silence was driving me crazy, so I called again. This time, she picked up, but her voice was cold, distant. "What is it, Mark?" she said, sounding impatient, like I was bothering her. I could barely keep my voice steady. "Amy, we need to talk." "I mean, did you really?" "Yes, Mark." "I did." Her tone was sharp, like she was daring me to make a fuss about it. "I don't understand why you're acting so shocked. We talked about this. It's not like I didn't give you a heads up." My heart sank, but I pushed on. "Amy, I thought that was just a joke. I never agreed to this, not in any serious way. This isn't what we do. We're married, Amy. We have kids. How could you even think?" "Oh, don't act like I'm some kind of monster," she snapped, cutting me off. "It was just one night, Mark. One night. It doesn't mean anything." I was stunned, speechless. She was talking like this was just some trivial thing, like she hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "It doesn't mean anything?" I repeated, trying to wrap my head around that. "You just threw everything away for a fantasy. For a stupid fantasy." She sighed, like she was tired of explaining herself. "Look, I don't have time for this right now. I'll be back home tomorrow. We can talk then if you're still feeling emotional." And with that, she hung up. Just like that. The day crawled by in slow motion. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I tried to keep busy, some memory of Amy would hit me out of nowhere. A laugh we'd shared, a trip we'd taken, something one of the kids had done that made us both crack up. All of it felt different now, like it belonged to someone else's life. By the time she was supposed to be home the next evening, I felt a strange mix of dread and anger. I still couldn't believe it. This was Amy, my wife, the same person I'd shared everything with for years. And now she was about to walk through the door like nothing had happened? I heard the car pull up in the driveway and then the sound of her keys jingling at the door. She came in, suitcase in hand, looking tired but calm. Almost too calm. She gave me a quick nod, barely making eye contact as she set her bag down. "Hey," she said, like she'd just come back from any ordinary business trip. "Hey," I repeated, feeling my anger starting to bubble up. "That's all you have to say?" She rolled her eyes, letting out a sigh as if she were the one inconvenienced here. "Mark, please. I told you we can talk, but I don't need some big guilt trip. It's done, it's over, let's just." "No," I cut in, my voice harder than I'd planned. "We're not just moving on. I need to understand what was going through your head. How could you just throw everything away like that?" She gave me this irritated look, like I was being unreasonable. "I didn't throw anything away. It was one night, Mark." "What?" "I don't see why you're making it into something bigger than it is." Her words felt like a slap. "How can you say that? How can you not see what this does to us? To me?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "Mark, I don't know what you want me to say. I told you about the hall pass. I didn't keep it a secret. It was just one night, and it's not like I'm running off with him." I tried to find the right words, but nothing was enough. "I trusted you, Amy. I thought we were on the same page, that our marriage was—" "Oh, please," she interrupted, giving a dismissive wave. "Don't be so dramatic. It was just some fun, Mark. If you can't handle it, that's on you. I'm not going to stand here and apologize for something we both agreed on." I was floored, barely recognizing the woman standing in front of me. The way she shrugged it off, like our whole marriage was just some casual arrangement. I knew then that nothing I said would matter to her, not in that moment. She moved to head upstairs, but I couldn't just let her walk away. I was still clinging to the hope that maybe I'd misunderstood, that there was some explanation I hadn't heard yet that would make sense of all this. "So, that's it?" I asked, voice shaking. "You're just going to brush this off like it's nothing?" She paused, turning to look at me with a smirk that was almost smug. "Mark, what exactly do you want me to say? You're acting like I had some kind of full-blown affair. It was one night with a guy I'll never see again. I've told you everything, but I couldn't let go. Maybe it was out of pure shock, or maybe it was the need to really understand what I'd lost, but I pushed further. Everything? Because I don't even get why you'd want to do this in the first place. Did you even think about me? About our kids?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't go dragging the kids into this. They have nothing to do with it." She crossed her arms, leaning casually against the stair railing like we were discussing something trivial, her tone icy. "You want the details, Mark?" Fine. Joshua and I had a few drinks, we talked, and yes, one thing led to another. He's not just some fantasy, okay? He was charming, he made me feel noticed, appreciated. The words hit like a punch. "Noticed?" I repeated, feeling the anger swell. "You're saying I don't notice you?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, she looked genuinely irritated. "You're here every day, Mark, but half the time, it feels like we're just going through the motions. The kids, the bills, your job. It's like you stopped seeing me a long time ago." The way she was talking, it was like she'd rewritten our whole marriage to justify what she'd done. "So you're blaming me for this?" "I'm saying that it just happened, okay?" she snapped. "And if you're expecting me to sit here begging for forgiveness, don't hold your breath. You knew I had a chance to meet him, and if you were so against it, you should have said something years ago." I was in disbelief. She wasn't apologetic, wasn't even slightly remorseful. She seemed almost proud, like she'd finally lived out some big dream. I stood there, watching her as she shrugged again, then turned and started walking up the stairs. As she headed upstairs, I felt this desperation bubbling up. It wasn't enough that she'd done it, she didn't even care about the damage she'd caused. Part of me wanted to let it go, to stop myself from digging any deeper. But another part of me knew I had to protect myself somehow. I had a gut feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I pulled out my phone and hit record. When she came back down a few minutes later, her face was relaxed, like she'd just settled in for the night. She glanced at me standing there in the living room, my arms crossed, and let out this exasperated sigh. "What now, Mark?" I kept my voice calm. "Amy, I just need to understand. I need you to tell me what happened, start to finish. Maybe it'll help me come to terms with it." She gave me an eye roll that felt like a slap. "Fine," she huffed, settling onto the couch like she was doing me some kind of favor. And she started talking, the words spilling out as if she were recounting an amusing story. She told me about meeting Joshua at the hotel bar, the flirting, the way he'd complimented her, like he really noticed me, you know? She laughed, like it was funny how easily he'd charmed her. I kept my face blank, not wanting her to see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "He was attentive," she said, a little smirk playing at her lips. "It was exciting, Mark. For once, I didn't feel like just a mom or just your wife. I felt desired." I forced myself to nod, barely managing to keep my voice steady. "So you went up to his room?" "Yeah," she said, not a hint of hesitation. "And look, it's not like I planned it. But it just felt so freeing. I mean, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Who wouldn't take it?" My grip tightened on my phone. I didn't know how much more I could take, but I let her keep talking. She went on about how it was all purely physical and how it didn't mean anything. It was like she was reciting some line she'd convinced herself was true. Finally, I couldn't keep quiet. "And you're just okay with that?" I asked, the frustration slipping out. "No guilt, no second thoughts?" She shrugged. "It's done, Mark. I don't see the point in dwelling on it. I had fun and now I'm back. End of story." I let out a slow breath, my heart pounding. I had the whole thing recorded. And though I wasn't entirely sure what I'd do with it yet, a strange sense of calm washed over me. At least now I had the truth, her version of it, anyway, and something told me I'd need it. After that night, things got quiet between us. Amy went back to her usual routine, almost as if nothing had happened. She'd spend her evenings on her phone, scrolling through social media, barely glancing my way. I kept to myself, working late whenever I could and avoiding her as much as possible. But the recording burned a hole in my mind. I knew I couldn't just let it sit there. A few days later, I decided to meet with a lawyer. It felt strange, like some surreal step I never imagined I'd have to take. But I needed advice. I needed someone to tell me where I stood, how to move forward. The lawyer listened carefully as I explained everything, nodding as I recounted Amy's call, her total lack of remorse, and then, finally, I mentioned the recording. "Smart move," he said, leaning back in his chair. "This could be important, especially if things escalate. And honestly, they might." His words hung in the air, making my stomach churn. I wasn't sure if I was ready for escalation, but then he asked if I knew who this Joshua Langston actually was. I frowned, a bit thrown. "He's an actor, right? Some soap opera star?" The lawyer's face turned serious. "Mark, there's something you should know. There's a known con artist who's been impersonating Joshua Langston. He shows up at events, bars, anywhere he thinks he'll find someone willing to believe he's the real thing. He's even been in the news for it." The room felt like it was spinning. I couldn't process what he was saying. "You're telling me this guy wasn't even who Amy thought he was?" He nodded grimly. "Most likely. And there's more. This imposter's been involved in several scandals, including one involving STDs. He's been known to prey on women who see him as this unattainable celebrity. Unfortunately, it seems like your wife may have been one of his targets." It was like a punch to the gut. Not only had Amy betrayed me, but she'd been conned by a fake, a man who'd taken advantage of her and put her at serious risk. Armed with this new information, I went home, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. I didn't know how to tell Amy. Part of me didn't even want to. But I knew I couldn't sit on this. She needed to know the truth, and honestly, I wanted to see if any part of her would feel some kind of regret when she realized just how far she'd been deceived. That night, once the kids were in bed, I found her sitting on the couch, flipping through channels like she didn't have a care in the world. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her, waiting until she finally looked up and met my eyes. "Amy," I started slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, "we need to talk about Joshua." Her face hardened instantly, like she was bracing herself for another argument. "Mark, I told you, I'm done talking about this. I'm not going to keep apologizing for something that's in the past." I shook my head. "This isn't about an apology. It's about the fact that the man you met wasn't Joshua Langston. He's an imposter, a con artist who goes around pretending to be him." She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I spoke to a lawyer, Amy," I said, feeling my voice steady as I explained what I'd learned. "This guy, whoever he's, has done this before. He pretends to be Joshua Langston, hooks up with women who think he's some famous star, and then disappears. He's a fraud." For a moment, her face registered shock, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd finally get it. But then she scoffed, crossing her arms defiantly. "I don't believe you." I blinked, thrown by her immediate denial. "Amy, this isn't something I'd just make up. This guy is known for it. He's even been in the news." "Of course you'd say that," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're just desperate to make me feel bad. You can't stand that I went through with it, so now you're trying to twist everything to make me regret it. It's pathetic, Mark." I felt the last thread of patience snap. "Are you serious? This guy could have put you at risk, and you don't even care?" She rolled her eyes. "I'm fine. Nothing happened. You're the one who can't move on." I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. "I hope you're right, Amy. Because if you're not, you're going to have a lot more to deal with than just me." And with that, I left the room, leaving her sitting in silence. The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Amy and I barely spoke, our conversations reduced to cold, clipped exchanges about the kids or the schedule. Part of me wanted to let it all go, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't ignore the risks she'd exposed herself, and by extension, all of us, to. By the end of the day, I knew what I had to do. I approached her in the kitchen, where she was washing dishes, and tried to keep my voice steady. "Amy, We need to be responsible about this. I think you should get tested." She paused, hands still in the soapy water, her eyes narrowing as she looked over at me. "Tested? For what?" "For SEs, Amy," I said, each word heavy. "You don't know this guy. You don't even know his real name." She threw down the dish towel, looking at me with disbelief and anger. "I can't believe you're going this far, Mark. I told you I'm fine. I don't need a test. This is just you trying to punish me." I felt my own anger rising, but I tried to stay calm. "This isn't about punishing you. It's about protecting you and protecting our family. You may not care about what this means for us, but I do." She crossed her arms, glaring at me, and for a moment, I thought she was going to refuse outright. But then she shrugged, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fine, Mark. If that's what you want, I'll get the test. Anything to end this little interrogation of yours." I took a breath, relieved but also filled with a heavy sadness. This wasn't how I ever imagined we'd be, standing here like strangers in our own kitchen. She pushed past me, grabbing her purse, muttering something about getting it over with, and stormed out. As I watched her leave, I wondered if she'd even take this seriously, or if this was just another way for her to prove, in her mind, that she'd done nothing wrong. All I could do now was wait, hoping for a clean result and maybe, somewhere down the line, a reason to trust her again. Days passed after Amy stormed out, and the silence between us grew colder. We barely spoke, existing under the same roof more like roommates than husband and wife. I went through the motions with the kids, focusing on keeping things normal for their sake, but there was this weight in the house. Every time I looked at her, I saw a stranger who, even now, didn't seem to grasp what she'd done or the risks she'd exposed us to. A week later, Amy came back from work holding an envelope. She walked in, tossed it onto the kitchen counter, and crossed her arms, looking at me with a mix of defiance and impatience. "There," she said flatly. "There's your proof. Go ahead, open it." I looked at the envelope, the sterile white paper feeling heavier than it should have. My heart was pounding, but I kept my expression steady. Slowly, I picked it up, tearing it open carefully, not saying a word. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the results. Negative. For a moment, I felt a rush of relief, a weight lifting slightly. At least that part of this nightmare was over. But when I glanced back up at Amy, expecting maybe some sign of relief, some shared moment of understanding, I saw only irritation on her face. "Happy now?" she asked, crossing her arms even tighter. "You put me through all that for nothing. I told you I'd be fine." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "Amy, you could have come back here with a completely different result. This isn't about me wanting to catch you in something. It's about the fact that you didn't even care about the risk." "Oh, here we go again," she sighed, rolling her eyes. "You just can't move on, can you? It was one night. One mistake. Why do you keep punishing me for it?" Her words hit like a slap. I felt the anger rise up, this raw, aching frustration. One night, one mistake? Do you really think it's that simple? You betrayed our trust, Amy. You threw away everything we had without even a second thought. She huffed, looking away, as if I was just wasting her time. "Mark, we're going in circles. I don't know what else you want from me. I did what you asked. I got the test. It's over." But it wasn't over, not for me. I realized then that she wasn't going to give me what I needed. She was determined to brush this off, to reduce it to a blip, a minor inconvenience in her mind. She didn't understand, or maybe she just didn't care. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, and looked her in the eye. "You really don't feel any guilt about this, do you? No regret for what you did, or how it's affected me, affected our family?" Her face softened for a moment, but then she quickly masked it with a shrug. "I told you, I'm sorry if it hurt you. But I'm not going to sit here beating myself up. I've moved on. And if you can't, maybe that's something you need to work out." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. This was the woman I'd built a life with, the person I thought I knew better than anyone. And now, standing here, I saw someone who didn't even flinch at the idea of tearing down everything we'd built. "Then maybe there's nothing left to work out," I said quietly, almost to myself. She raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Are you threatening me with divorce, Mark? Really? I don't know, I replied, feeling the truth of it settle in. Maybe I am. Because I can't keep doing this, living with someone who sees our marriage as a joke, as something disposable. It's like you don't even care about what you've done. She was silent for a moment, maybe realizing for the first time that this was real, that we weren't just having another argument we could sweep under the rug. But then she hardened, her voice cold. Fine, Mark. If you want a divorce, go ahead. But don't expect me to fall apart over it. You're the one with the problem, not me. You're the one who can't move on. Her words cut deep and I could barely speak. It felt like I'd been trying to salvage something that she'd already let go of, something that didn't even matter to her anymore. She turned to walk away, leaving me standing there with the test results still clutched in my hand, and I realized that the woman I'd loved for so many years was gone, or maybe she'd never been there at all. I watched her disappear down the hallway, feeling the finality of it settle in. This was it. After that conversation, it was like a door closed in my mind. I'd been holding out hope, fighting to save something that she didn't care about, trying to find some glimpse of the person I thought I'd married. But there was nothing left. It was time to protect myself, to prepare for whatever was coming, even if that meant facing an end I hadn't wanted. The first step was documenting everything. That recording I'd made the night she returned felt like a lifeline now, a way to hold on to the truth of what happened, no matter how she tried to twist it. I started backing it up, storing copies on a secure drive, making sure I wouldn't lose it if things got ugly. I knew it might come in handy if we went to court, especially if she tried to paint herself as the victim or rewrite what had happened. Then I went through our shared finances. It was shocking, honestly, how much I hadn't paid attention to over the years. I started to notice transactions I hadn't made, withdrawals and charges that didn't add up. When I pieced it all together, a new picture started to form, one I'd been too blind to see before. Over the past few months, she'd been slowly draining money from our accounts, bit by bit, as if she'd been preparing for something herself. The reality of it hit hard. She'd been planning this for a while, setting up a way out while keeping me in the dark. And here I was, struggling to hold on to a marriage that, to her, was already gone. The more I discovered, the angrier I felt. She'd been lying to me for longer than I'd realized, and not just with her words. She'd been planning, acting behind my back, putting her own interests above our family's stability. With every new piece of information, I felt a strange mix of betrayal and relief. Betrayal, because it was clear she'd been ready to abandon us long before that night with her so-called hall pass. Relief, because this solidified everything I needed to know about her intentions. She wasn't the person I thought I'd married. She wasn't my partner, and she certainly wasn't my ally. The next step was meeting with my lawyer again, this time with all the evidence I'd gathered. I wanted to make sure I had everything in place to protect myself and, most importantly, our kids. When I handed over the recording, the financial statements, and a timeline of events, my lawyer nodded with this look of approval. "This is solid, Mark," he said, flipping through the documents. "You're in a strong position here. Given her actions, especially with the financial evidence, the court will likely take your side. You've been prepared." But as he looked up at me, his expression softened. "Have you told her any of this yet?" I shook my head, feeling the weight of it settle on me. "No. I wanted to make sure I had everything in order first. I don't want her trying to twist this on me." He nodded in understanding. "Smart. But be ready, Mark. Once she knows you're prepared, things could get ugly. If she's been pulling money out, she may be ready to leave sooner than you think. And when people feel cornered, they can get desperate." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I knew this was going to be a fight, and the woman I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with was now someone I had to guard myself against. The idea of it was heartbreaking, but I had to stay strong, for myself and for the kids. There was no going back now. I left the lawyer's office feeling both terrified and determined. This was the beginning of the end, and I was finally ready to face it head-on. That evening, as I drove home, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I'd been carrying this weight for so long, walking on eggshells, trying to find some way to reach Amy. But now, knowing what I knew, I felt a sense of purpose, a sense of finally taking control. When I walked in, Amy was in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone like she had no care in the world. She barely glanced up as I set my bag down, as if we were just two people sharing a space rather than a life. I took a deep breath, then went over to her, standing on the other side of the counter, waiting for her to look at me. After a few moments, she finally looked up, clearly annoyed. "What is it now, Mark? Can we skip the lecture this time?" I held her gaze, keeping my voice steady. "Amy, we need to talk, seriously talk. I know you've been taking money out of our accounts." Her face paled, just for a split second, before she masked it with a forced, dismissive smile. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Amy. I went through our statements. You've been slowly draining money, setting yourself up for, what, exactly? Running off? Starting over somewhere else?" She laughed, though it sounded hollow. "You're being ridiculous. I've been using the money for family expenses, for the kids." "No, you haven't," I said, cutting her off, holding up the statements I'd printed out. "These charges aren't for the kids. They aren't even local. You've been preparing for this, haven't you? Setting yourself up for an exit?" She glared at me, the anger finally flashing in her eyes. "So what if I was? You don't get to control me. You don't get to hold me back from what I want." I felt my jaw clench, her words striking deeper than I'd expected. "And what exactly is that, Amy? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you don't want this family, this marriage, any of it." She crossed her arms, defiant. "Maybe I don't. Maybe I've been trapped in this suburban nightmare for long enough. Did you ever think that maybe I wanted more? That maybe I deserve more?" I swallowed, feeling a hollow ache as I looked at the woman I thought I'd known. "And what about the kids, Amy? You can throw me away all you want, but they didn't ask for this. They didn't deserve any of this." For a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something like guilt, but she quickly hardened again. "The kids will be fine. I'm still their mother. Just because we're done doesn't mean I don't care about them." "Funny way of showing it," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You put them at risk with your fling, lied to them, drained money that should have gone toward their future. And now you're acting like none of it matters." She scoffed, throwing her hands up. "This isn't just about them, Mark. This is about me finally having a life, about not being chained to you and this suffocating setup. And I'm not going to let you stop me from living the life I want." I could feel my heart sinking, but there was a strange sense of clarity too. I looked her dead in the eyes. "Then maybe you should go live it. Because I'm done, Amy. I'm done trying to hold on to someone who's already gone." She stared at me, stunned. For once, she didn't have a quick, cutting reply. She just stood there, watching as I walked past her, the papers still clutched in my hand. As I left the room, I felt the reality settle in. The life we'd built was over. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd fought to keep, had made her choice. And now I was making mine. After that confrontation with Amy, I knew the next step would be the hardest part of all, telling the kids. They'd sensed the tension between us, that much was clear, but they had no idea just how bad things had gotten. I'd done my best to shield them, keeping arguments behind closed doors and trying to keep things normal for as long as I could. But now, normal wasn't an option. They deserved honesty, even if it meant breaking their hearts. I planned to tell them once Amy left for one of her weekend trips she'd arranged for herself, which she probably thought I didn't know about. But I knew. I'd known for weeks. When Saturday morning rolled around, Amy barely said a word as she threw a few things into a bag, her eyes avoiding mine. She left without a goodbye, her car pulling out of the driveway as I watched from the window, steeling myself for what came next. I called the kids into the living room, my heart pounding as they settled onto the couch, their eyes wide with curiosity, sensing the seriousness of the moment. They were still young, still innocent to all the complicated things going on. I hated that I was about to shatter that innocence. "Hey guys," I started, my voice softer than usual. I could feel my throat tighten, but I pressed on, forcing myself to stay steady. "I wanted to talk to you about some changes that are going to happen." Our daughter, the older of the two, immediately picked up on my tone, her eyes widening with worry. "Is everything okay, Dad?" I took a deep breath, glancing down, then meeting their gaze. Things between Mom and me, they haven't been very good lately. You probably noticed that we haven't been spending as much time together, or that we've been tense around each other. Our son just nodded, looking from me to his sister. He didn't say anything, but I could see the questions forming in his mind. I cleared my throat, struggling to find the words. Sometimes, when adults have problems they can't fix, they decide it's better to not live together anymore. Our daughter's lip quivered, and she hugged her knees to her chest. Are you saying you're getting a divorce? I felt a lump form in my throat. Hearing the word from her made it so much more real. Yes, sweetie. That's what it means. Your mom and I are going to live separately, but we both love you so much. Nothing about that will ever change. Our son finally spoke, his voice small and hesitant. Is it because of us? My heart broke in that instant. I leaned forward, pulling both of them into a hug. No, not at all. This isn't because of you. You both have been the best part of our lives, and nothing you did could ever change that. This is between your mom and me. They sat in silence, their small hands clutching onto me. I could feel the confusion and hurt radiating from them, and I wished I could do more to shield them from it. But I knew that all I could do now was be there for them, as steady and present as I could be, even in the middle of all this upheaval. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, holding on to each other. I felt a new determination rise within me. No matter what happened with Amy, no matter how ugly things got, I would be here for my kids. They would always come first. I would make sure of that. And as I held them close, I knew that even though our family was about to change, I would do everything in my power to make sure they still felt safe, loved, and cared for. After I told the kids, a kind of uneasy calm settled over the house. They were quiet and withdrawn, processing everything in their own ways. I knew this was just the beginning, that the questions and heartbreak would come in waves, but for now, they seemed to accept what I'd told them. When Amy returned the next evening, she didn't seem to notice that anything was different. She breezed in, barely sparing a glance at any of us, heading straight upstairs to unpack. It was like she'd already detached herself from the family, mentally packing up along with her things. But the kids, they felt it now. They knew the truth behind her absence, the weight of what was happening. Our daughter, usually the one to run up and show her mom something she'd drawn or talk about her day, barely looked at her. Our son kept his eyes glued to his game, ignoring the footsteps that echoed through the house. As I watched Amy move around like a stranger in her own home, it struck me how final everything felt. There was no going back, no pretending anymore. Later that night, as she settled onto the couch with her phone, I took a seat across from her. She looked up briefly, annoyed, before returning her attention to her screen. We need to talk, I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. She didn't even look up. About what, Mark? We've talked this to death. About what happens next, I replied, my tone firm. I've told the kids. They know about the divorce. That got her attention. She looked up sharply, her expression shifting from annoyance to something closer to anger. You told them? Without talking to me first? I nodded, meeting her glare with a calm I didn't quite feel. Yes. They deserve to hear it from me, not to wonder why things felt wrong. They had a right to know. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Great. So now they hate me, is that it? I shook my head, fighting back the urge to respond with anger. No, they're just confused. And hurt. They don't understand why this is happening any more than I do. She stared at me, a mixture of frustration and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe guilt, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the same dismissive attitude I'd come to expect. So what's your plan, Mark? She asked, crossing her arms. You're clearly all geared up for this, so go ahead. Lay it out for me. I took a deep breath. The plan is simple. We go through with the divorce. I'm filing for full custody of the kids. I want them to have stability, and with the choices you've made, I don't think you're in a position to give that to them. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear there. You can't be serious. You think you're just going to take them away from me? If you want joint custody, you're going to have to prove that you're committed to being there for them, I said, my voice calm but unyielding. That means no more disappearing on weekends, no more sneaking money out of our accounts. You need to show them that they matter more than whatever freedom you think you're chasing. Her face flushed, a mix of anger and something like panic. This is unbelievable. You're turning this around to make me look like the bad guy, as if I haven't been here, as if I haven't been their mother. Being their mother doesn't mean disappearing whenever you feel like it, Amy, I shot back, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. They need stability, not someone who's more invested in her own fantasies than in their lives. She fell silent, her jaw clenched as she glared at me. I could see the wheels turning, the calculations running through her mind. She'd never expected this, had thought she'd always have control. And now, for the first time, she realized I wasn't backing down. Fine, she said eventually, her voice tight. You want to fight, Mark? You've got one. She stormed off, leaving me alone in the living room, the silence settling in around me like a heavy fog. But even as I sat there, the anger and frustration fading into a hollow ache, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was finally fighting for what mattered. After that night, everything shifted. Amy barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was clipped, filled with resentment. She spent more time out of the house, sometimes disappearing for hours without a word. Meanwhile, I started gathering every bit of evidence I had, bank statements, proof of her withdrawals, that recording of her unapologetic confession. I didn't want it to come to this, but I knew I had to be prepared. I filed for divorce a week later, submitting the custody request with it. When Amy was served the papers, she reacted with a mix of shock and anger. I'd always been the one to keep things calm, to let things go in order to keep the peace. But now she was seeing that this time, I wasn't going to back down. The next day, she called her own lawyer. She made it clear, through thinly veiled comments and occasional jabs, that she wasn't going to let me take full custody of the kids without a fight. The whole thing was surreal. It felt like we were gearing up for war, but we were still living under the same roof, passing each other in the hallway like strangers. During those weeks, I noticed the tension weighing heavily on the kids. They didn't understand all the details, but they could sense that something big was happening, something that wasn't going away. Our daughter, especially, grew quiet and withdrawn. It broke my heart to see her like that, knowing how much she was trying to hold herself together. Finally, the first court date arrived. Walking into the courtroom, I felt an overwhelming mixture of dread and determination. I had my lawyer by my side, my evidence organized, ready for whatever Amy might throw at me. As we took our seats, I couldn't help but glance over at her, trying to understand how we'd come to this. She sat across the aisle, her face expressionless, her gaze focused straight ahead. The hearing began with both lawyers presenting their cases. My lawyer highlighted my role as the primary caregiver, the one who kept things stable while Amy pursued her personal interests. He brought up the financial records, showing how Amy had secretly drained money from our accounts, money that should have been for the family. I could see the judge taking it all in, her eyes narrowing as she glanced over at Amy, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then it was Amy's turn. Her lawyer tried to paint her in a sympathetic light, portraying her as a mother who deserved equal custody, who had simply been seeking balance in her life. Amy even attempted to play the victim, claiming that I was controlling and unsupportive, trying to paint a picture that wasn't remotely close to the reality of our marriage. I gritted my teeth as she spoke, forcing myself to stay calm. But when they suggested that I was the one making her feel trapped, I finally couldn't stay silent. I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "I've always been there for the kids, Your Honor," I said, looking directly at the judge. "I've put them first, even when things between Amy and me were falling apart. I'm not trying to cut her out of their lives. I'm just trying to give them stability, something they've been missing." Amy's lawyer looked annoyed, but the judge nodded, considering my words carefully. She turned her gaze to Amy, who looked visibly rattled. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Then my lawyer introduced the recording. I watched as Amy's face went pale, her mouth opening slightly in shock. She hadn't expected this. The recording played for the court, her cold, unremorseful words filling the room, describing her encounter with the fake celebrity as if it were nothing more than a harmless adventure. The judge's face tightened as she listened, her expression hardening. By the end of it, The courtroom was silent. Amy's lawyer tried to recover, but the damage was done. Her own words had exposed the truth. Her disregard for our marriage, her lack of guilt, her focus on herself over our family. The judge gave us both a long, thoughtful look. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks," she said finally, her tone serious. "But I want both parties to consider what's truly best for the children here." As we left the courtroom, Amy shot me a look that was a mix of fury and desperation. She hadn't expected any of this, hadn't thought I'd be prepared. But I was. And for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life again, standing up not just for myself, but for my kids. The battle wasn't over yet, but I knew that I'd done everything I could to protect what mattered most. The next 2 weeks felt like a waiting game, filled with tension and uncertainty. Amy and I barely exchanged words. She kept to herself, spending her nights out or in her room, while I focused on the kids, trying to keep life as steady as possible for them. They still didn't understand everything, and I didn't want them to feel the weight of the fight going on around them. Finally, the day of the final hearing arrived. My lawyer and I prepared ourselves, going over every piece of evidence one last time. I felt a strange mix of dread and hope, knowing that whatever happened today would decide the future, for me, for Amy, and most importantly, for the kids. As we entered the courtroom, I glanced at Amy. She looked anxious, her face drawn and pale, her usual confidence replaced by something closer to fear. Her lawyer whispered to her as we all settled into our seats, but I could tell she was rattled. She hadn't expected this fight, hadn't thought I'd stand my ground. The judge entered, and everyone fell silent. She wasted no time, diving straight into her ruling. Her voice was calm but firm, her words echoing through the room as she reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and everything that had been said in the previous hearings. After reviewing the details of this case, it's clear that both parties have had a significant impact on the children's lives, she began, her gaze moving between Amy and me. However, it is also clear that one parent has demonstrated a greater commitment to providing stability, consistency, and prioritizing the welfare of the children. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands clenched tightly together, her lawyer staring intently at the judge, as if trying to will a favorable outcome. The judge continued, "In light of the evidence presented, including the financial records and recorded statements, it is apparent that Mr. Davidson has been the primary caregiver and has shown an unwavering dedication to his children's well-being." She paused, her eyes moving to Amy. "Mrs. Davidson, your actions indicate a concerning pattern of neglect regarding financial responsibilities and personal priorities." I felt a surge of relief as her words sank in, though I tried to stay calm, not wanting to get ahead of myself. "Therefore," the judge said, "I am awarding primary custody of the children to Mr. Davidson. Mrs. Davidson will retain visitation rights, to be scheduled in a manner that prioritizes the children's routines and stability. Additionally, given the misuse of family funds, I am mandating a financial review to ensure that all remaining assets are appropriately allocated toward the children's needs." The words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I glanced over at Amy, whose face had gone from pale to red, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She leaned over to her lawyer, whispering frantically, but there was no changing the judge's decision. It was final. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the hearing, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. It wasn't the ending I'd ever wanted for our family, but it was the best outcome for the kids. I knew I could give them the stability and support they needed to move forward. After the hearing, as we filed out of the courtroom, Amy approached me, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "Mark, you can't just take them from me," she hissed, her voice barely controlled. "This isn't fair. I'm their mother." I looked at her, feeling a deep sadness, but also a strange sense of calm. "Amy, this was your choice. You made decisions that put yourself first, over our marriage, over our kids. And now you have to live with that." Her face crumpled, her confidence finally shattered. She turned away without another word, walking quickly out of the courthouse. I watched her go, feeling a pang of sadness, but also a strange peace. This chapter was finally closed. That evening, I went home to my kids, ready to start a new life focused on them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, But for the first time, I felt ready. I'd fought for them, for us, and I knew we'd be okay. In that quiet moment, surrounded by my children, I felt the weight of the past lift. We'd lost something, yes, but we'd gained something too. A fresh start, a chance to rebuild, a future that we could finally call our own.